The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the old depot platform into a mirror of dark water and flickering lamplight. Margaret stood beneath the overhang, clutching a worn leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother. She checked her watch for the 100th time. 7:30. The train was late again, just like it had been for the past 3 nights. Her fingers trembled as she pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill. She had made a promise, one that most people would call foolish. Her husband James had left on a supply run to the neighboring town 5 days ago. In the chaos of the war's end, with soldiers returning home and refugees flooding the railways, communication had become impossible. The telephone lines were down. The postal service had collapsed. All she had was his final words before he boarded that northbound train: "Wait for me at the depot. No matter what happens, I'll come back on the evening train." 3 days ago, that promise had seemed simple enough. Now, standing in the cold rain with her hope wearing thin, Margaret wondered if she had been naive. The ticket master, old Henry with his salt and pepper beard, had stopped trying to convince her to go home. He simply brought her coffee now, steaming cups that she barely touched, watching them grow cold in her hands as she stared down the empty tracks. The war had changed everything. Towns that once thrived now stood half empty. Families had been torn apart, scattered like leaves in a storm. Margaret had lost her brother in the final offensive, her father to illness the winter before. James was all she had left in this world. The thought of losing him too made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. So she waited, because waiting was the only thing left that she could control. Other passengers came and went. A mother with 3 small children, heading west to stay with relatives. An elderly couple, reuniting with a son they hadn't seen in 4 years. A businessman in a wrinkled suit, muttering about delayed shipments and lost contracts. They all looked at Margaret with varying degrees of pity and curiosity. The woman who wouldn't leave. The wife who stood vigil like a lighthouse keeper watching for ships that might never come. Henry approached her again as the clock struck 8. "Mrs. Patterson," he said gently, "the last train just came through. There won't be another until tomorrow morning." His eyes held the kind of sympathy that made Margaret's throat burn with unshed tears. She knew what he was thinking. Everyone thought it. James wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened in that northern town had claimed him, just as the war had claimed so many others. But Margaret shook her head. "I'll wait," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "He'll come." Henry sighed but didn't argue. He'd learned that much over the past 3 days. Instead, he retreated to his office, leaving her alone with the sound of rain and the distant whistle of a freight train passing through without stopping. The depot grew quieter as night deepened. The overhead lamps buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows across the platform. Margaret sat on the wooden bench, her suitcase beside her, and let her mind drift back to better times. She remembered the day James had proposed, right here on this very platform, as she was about to leave for her sister's wedding. She remembered his laugh, warm and genuine, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She remembered dancing in their tiny kitchen, no music but the rhythm of their hearts beating together. Those memories were all she had to keep the darkness at bay. As midnight approached and the temperature dropped, Margaret made a decision. She would wait through the night. She would wait through tomorrow and the day after that if necessary. She had made a promise too, though she'd never spoken it aloud. She would be here when James returned. Because love, real love, didn't give up when things got hard. It waited. It endured. It held on even when logic said to let go. The rain continued to fall, and Margaret Patterson waited. Dawn broke grey and cheerless over the depot, painting the world in shades of ash and silver. Margaret's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she remained upright on her bench, watching the tracks emerge from the morning mist. Her body ached with cold and exhaustion, but she barely noticed. All her focus was channeled into that distant point where the rails converged, where any moment a train might appear bringing James home. The morning train arrived at 6:15, exactly on schedule. Margaret stood as passengers disembarked, scanning each face with desperate hope. Soldiers in uniform, civilians in travel clothes, a priest with a weathered Bible tucked under his arm. But no James. Her heart sank lower with each person who passed, until the platform emptied and the train pulled away, leaving nothing but diesel smoke and disappointment in its wake. Henry arrived for his shift, his face registering surprise that she was still there. He brought her fresh coffee and a bag containing a warm roll from the bakery across the street. "You need to eat," he said firmly, pressing it into her hands. Margaret took it mechanically, more to ease his worry than from any real hunger. The food tasted like sawdust in her mouth, but she forced it down anyway. As the morning wore on, Other depot workers began to notice her continued presence. They whispered among themselves, glancing her way with expressions ranging from concern to skepticism. Margaret ignored them all. She had become a fixture here, as permanent as the wooden benches and the painted advertisements on the walls. Nothing they said or thought mattered. Only James mattered. Only keeping her promise mattered. Around 10 o'clock, a man in a dark overcoat approached her. He was perhaps 50 years old, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He sat down on the bench beside her without asking permission, which immediately put Margaret on edge. "Mrs. Patterson," he said quietly, and the fact that he knew her name sent a chill down her spine. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse and the cold night air. The man didn't smile. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased as if it had been carried for some time. "My name is William Cross. I was on the last supply train from Millbrook, the town your husband traveled to." Margaret's heart began to pound. "You've seen James?" Cross's expression remained neutral, carefully controlled. "I saw what happened in Millbrook," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "There was an accident at the supply depot. A warehouse fire. Several men were caught inside when the roof collapsed." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, a small sound of distress escaping before she could stop it. Cross continued, his voice low and steady. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband's name was on the casualty list." The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret. She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible. He would have sent word. Someone would have contacted me." Cross unfolded the paper in his hands, revealing a typed list of names. There, halfway down the page, she saw it, James Patterson, followed by their address. "The communication systems are still disrupted," Cross explained. "Official notifications are taking weeks to process. I came here personally because I knew someone should tell you. I knew you were waiting." He paused, his eyes softening slightly. "I'm sorry. But you should go home. Grieve properly. There's nothing for you here but false hope." Margaret stared at the list, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. "How do you know the list is accurate?" she demanded, anger suddenly flaring hot in her chest. "Things are confused right now. Mistakes happen. Names get mixed up." Cross sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "I understand this is difficult. But I was there. I helped pull bodies from the wreckage. I'm telling you this as a kindness, so you don't waste days or weeks waiting for someone who can't come back." He stood, leaving the paper on the bench beside her. "Go home, Mrs. Patterson. Say your goodbyes. Start the process of healing." Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing on the platform until they faded into the general noise of the depot. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the list in her hands. Part of her wanted to crumple it up, throw it away, pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part, the practical part that had helped her survive this long, whispered that Cross might be right. Henry appeared at her side. He'd clearly overheard the conversation. "Margaret," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. "Maybe you should consider what he said. I know it's hard, but holding on when there's no hope left will only hurt you more." Margaret looked up at him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "He promised," she said, her voice breaking. "James promised he would come back." "Sometimes promises can't be kept," Henry replied gently. "Sometimes circumstances are beyond our control." Margaret wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. She looked down at the list again, at James's name printed in stark black letters. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. When she looked up at Henry, her jaw was set with determination. "I'm staying," she said. "Until I see him, until someone brings me proof that can't be questioned, I'm staying." Henry opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He recognized that look. It was the same stubborn resolve he'd seen in soldiers who refused to abandon their posts, in mothers who wouldn't stop searching for lost children. It was the look of someone who had drawn a line and would not be moved. "All right," he said finally. "Then at least let me bring you a blanket and some proper food. If you're going to do this, do it without catching pneumonia." Margaret nodded gratefully, and Henry walked away shaking his head. As the day wore on and more trains came and went, Margaret remained on her bench, the casualty list heavy in her pocket but her hope, somehow, still burning bright. The depot took on a different character after dark. During the day, it bustled with purpose and movement, people coming and going with places to be and schedules to keep. But at night, it became something else entirely. The shadows grew longer and deeper. The sounds changed, becoming hollow and distant. The few remaining lights cast pools of yellow illumination that made the surrounding darkness seem absolute. This was Margaret's fourth night, and the isolation was beginning to wear on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The bench had become unbearably hard despite the blanket Henry had provided. Her body ached in places she'd never noticed before. More troubling were the moments when she would catch herself drifting, not quite asleep but not fully awake either, suspended in a strange space where reality and memory blurred together. She would see James in those moments, standing at the end of the platform just beyond the reach of the lights. He would wave to her, smiling that warm smile she loved, and she would start to stand, to call out to him. Then consciousness would snap back and she would realize she was staring at nothing, at shadows and empty space playing tricks on her exhausted mind. Around 11 o'clock, a young woman emerged from the depot's small waiting room. She couldn't have been more than 20, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and eyes that held a depth of sadness that seemed far too old for her face. She carried a thermos and 2 cups. "You look like you could use some company," she said, settling onto the bench beside Margaret without waiting for permission. Margaret was too tired to protest. The woman poured tea into both cups, the steam rising in ghostly wisps. "My name is Annie," she said, handing 1 cup to Margaret. "I've been watching you these past few days. That kind of dedication, it means something. It tells a story." Margaret wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup, grateful for both the heat and the human contact. "What story does it tell?" Annie looked out at the dark tracks, her expression distant. "That you loved someone enough to break yourself trying to keep a promise. I understand that. I did the same thing once." She took a sip of her tea, and Margaret noticed her hand trembled slightly. "There was a man I loved. David. He went off to war like so many others, and I waited for him. Wrote him letters every day. Kept his picture on my nightstand. Told everyone who would listen that he was coming home." "Did he?" Margaret asked quietly. Annie's smile was sad and knowing. "No. He died in some field hospital, thousands of miles away. But I didn't know that for months. I kept waiting, kept believing, even when his letters stopped coming. Even when his mother received the notification and tried to tell me. I refused to believe it until I saw his grave myself." Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her chest. "Why are you telling me this?" Annie turned to look at her directly, her eyes intense in the lamplight. "Because I want you to understand that I'm not here to tell you to give up. I'm here to tell you that I understand why you won't. The world will call us foolish. They'll say we're wasting our time, living in denial. But they don't understand that sometimes waiting is the only way we can survive the not knowing. It's the last act of love we have left to give." The word struck something deep inside Margaret, bringing tears to her eyes. "I saw a casualty list," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man brought it yesterday. James's name was on it." Annie nodded slowly, as if she'd suspected as much. "And yet you're still here." "I have to be," Margaret said, the words tumbling out now. "Because lists can be wrong. Records get confused. In all this chaos, mistakes happen every day. And because he promised. James has never broken a promise to me, not once in all the years we've been together. If he said he would come back, then somewhere, somehow, he's trying to keep that promise. My job is to be here when he does." Annie reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Then you wait," she said simply. "You wait for as long as you need to. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their tea and watching the empty tracks. Eventually, Annie stood to leave. "I work at the hospital across town," she said. "I'll come back tomorrow night if you're still here. Bring more tea and maybe some food." "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked, genuinely confused. Annie smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Because someone should have sat with me on those nights when I was waiting. Someone should have told me it was okay to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Consider it a debt I'm paying forward." She walked away, disappearing into the depot building, leaving Margaret alone again but somehow less isolated than before. The night deepened. A freight train rumbled through without stopping, its cargo cars creating a rhythmic percussion that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Margaret pulled her blanket tighter and allowed herself to remember more. She remembered James teaching her to drive his old truck, patient even when she ground the gears. She remembered him building bookshelves for their home, measuring 3 times and cutting once, always precise. She remembered the way he held her during storms, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. These memories were precious beyond measure, but they were also torture. Each one reminded her of what she stood to lose, what she might have already lost. The casualty list in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, demanding acknowledgement. But Margaret pushed the thought away. She had chosen hope. She had chosen to believe in promises kept and love rewarded. Tomorrow might bring different truths, but tonight, in this moment, she would hold on to faith. Henry checked on her one last time before his shift ended. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" he asked, more statement than question. Margaret nodded. "Then I'll see you in the morning. Try to get some rest." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I hope you're right. I hope he walks off that train and proves all of us wrong." "So do I," Margaret whispered. "So do I." The clock on the depot wall ticked toward midnight, each second measured and counted. Margaret closed her eyes, not to sleep but to focus every ounce of her will into a single thought, a single prayer. "Come home, James. Whatever you're facing, wherever you are, come home. I'm here. I'm waiting. I'll always be waiting." The fourth night stretched on, endless and cold, but Margaret endured. She had come too far to stop now. The fifth day arrived with a biting wind that cut through Margaret's layers of clothing like a knife. She had stopped feeling truly warm sometime during the previous night, her body settling into a state of constant chill that no amount of blankets seemed to remedy. Her reflection in the depot window showed a woman she barely recognized. Her face had become gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, her hair disheveled. She looked like someone who had wandered in from the edges of civilization, not a respectable woman waiting for her husband. The morning train came and went. Then the midday. Then the afternoon. Each arrival brought the same crushing disappointment, the same empty platform after the passengers dispersed. Margaret had stopped counting the trains. She had stopped checking her watch. Time had become meaningless, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the rhythmic arrival and departure of locomotives. Around 2 in the afternoon, a well-dressed woman approached her. She had the look of someone important, someone used to being listened to and obeyed. "Mrs. Patterson," she said crisply, "my name is Evelyn Hartford. I'm with the Women's Relief Society. We've heard about your situation, and we're here to help." She gestured to a younger woman standing nearby with a clipboard. "We have a car waiting. We can take you to a proper facility where you can rest, get a hot meal, perhaps speak with a counselor." Margaret looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. "I'm not leaving," she said flatly. Evelyn's expression tightened with barely concealed frustration. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand you're grieving. We all lost people in the war. But this behavior is neither healthy nor productive. You're making a spectacle of yourself. People are talking. It reflects poorly on everyone." "Let them talk," Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength from some reserve she didn't know she possessed. "I don't care what people think. I care about keeping my promise." Evelyn's facade of sympathy cracked, revealing irritation beneath. "Your husband is dead. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can begin to heal and move on with your life. This obsessive waiting helps no one." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She stood up from her bench, swaying slightly from the sudden movement. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what happened to James. You don't know anything about him or about us. You have no right to come here and tell me how to grieve or what to believe." The confrontation was drawing attention. Other people on the platform had stopped to watch. Henry emerged from his office, clearly preparing to intervene if necessary. Evelyn drew herself up to her full height. "I have every right to be concerned when someone is clearly suffering from a mental breakdown in a public space. If you won't accept help voluntarily, there are other measures that can be taken for your own protection." Margaret felt something snap inside her. All the fear, the exhaustion, the doubt she'd been pushing down for days came roaring to the surface in a wave of fury. "Get away from me," she said, her voice rising. "I don't need your protection or your help or your judgment. I need my husband. And until someone can prove to me beyond any doubt that he's not coming back, I'm staying right here." "You saw the casualty list," Evelyn pressed, and Margaret realized that everyone seemed to know about that list, that her private grief had become public gossip. "That man showed you proof. Your husband was killed in a warehouse fire. Why are you so determined to deny reality?" Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold skin. "Because reality is what we choose to believe in," she said. "And I choose to believe in James. I choose to believe in promises and love and the possibility of miracles. Maybe that makes me crazy. Maybe that makes me pathetic. But it makes me human, and it keeps me going when everything else says to quit. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Henry stepped between them. That's enough, he said firmly. Mrs. Hartford, I appreciate your concern, but Mrs. Patterson is not breaking any laws. She has as much right to be on this platform as anyone else. I'm going to have to ask you to leave her alone. Evelyn's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. She needs professional help, not encouragement to continue this delusion. What she needs, Henry said quietly, is compassion and space. Now please, go. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, then turned on her heel and stalked away, her assistant scurrying after her. The small crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, leaving Margaret trembling on her bench. Henry sat down beside her. Are you all right? Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. The confrontation had drained what little energy she had left. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except the most basic determination to keep breathing, keep waiting. Henry put a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're at your breaking point, he observed. I can see it. You can't keep going like this much longer. I know, Margaret admitted, her voice cracking. But I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to walk away. They sat together in silence, the wind whipping across the platform and making the overhead lamps sway on their chains. Finally, Henry spoke. Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone here? Margaret looked at him, curious despite her exhaustion. During the war, Henry continued, my son was reported missing in action. They never found his body, never confirmed what happened. For 2 years, I waited for news. Every telegram, every phone call made my heart stop. My wife wanted to hold a memorial service, to find closure. But I couldn't. I kept thinking, what if he's out there somewhere? What if he comes home and thinks we gave up on him? What happened? Margaret asked softly. Henry's eyes were distant, focused on something only he could see. Eventually, I realized that waiting was destroying me. It was destroying my marriage, my relationship with my other children. So I made a choice. I decided to believe he was at peace, wherever he was. I let him go. He turned to look at Margaret directly. I'm not telling you to do the same. I'm just telling you that whatever you decide, whether you wait another hour or another year, it's your choice. Don't let people like Evelyn Hartford make you feel wrong for choosing hope. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a tight knot of shame she hadn't realized she was carrying. Thank you, she whispered. Henry patted her shoulder and stood up. Evening train comes in at 6. Annie stopped by earlier and left some supplies for you in my office. Food, a better blanket, some dry clothes. Come get them when you're ready. As he walked away, Margaret looked up at the sky. Clouds were gathering, dark and heavy with the promise of more rain. The temperature was dropping. Tonight would be worse than the previous nights, she could feel it. Her body was screaming at her to give up, to accept defeat and go home. But her heart, that stubborn, faithful heart, refused to surrender. One more night, she told herself. Just one more night. The depot platform stretched before her, empty and cold. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed. Margaret closed her eyes and sent out a silent call into the universe. James, if you can hear me, please hurry. I don't know how much longer I can do this. But I'm here. I'm still here. Always. Night fell on the depot for the 5th time, and with it came the promised rain. It started as a drizzle, barely more than mist, but within an hour it had escalated into a downpour that turned the platform into a treacherous sheet of flowing water. Margaret had moved closer to the building, huddled under the narrow overhang that provided minimal shelter. Annie had come as promised, bringing a waterproof tarp that she helped Margaret wrap around her shoulders like a tent. This is insane, Annie said, though her tone held admiration rather than criticism. You should see yourself right now. You look like a drowned rat who refuses to surrender. Despite everything, Margaret managed a weak laugh. I feel like one too. They shared some soup that Annie had brought in a thermos, the warmth spreading through Margaret's body like liquid gold. Thank you, Margaret said. For being kind when everyone else thinks I've lost my mind. Annie smiled. Maybe you have. But maybe that's what love requires sometimes. A little bit of insanity. She stayed for an hour, keeping Margaret company as the storm raged. When she finally left to return to her shift at the hospital, Margaret was alone again with nothing but the sound of rain and the creaking of the depot's old roof. The last scheduled train was due at 8:30. It came and went, disgorging its passengers quickly as people hurried to escape the weather. Margaret watched each face through the sheets of rain, her heart sinking lower with each unfamiliar person who passed. By 9 o'clock, the platform was deserted except for her. Henry had stayed late, worried about her being out in the storm, but even he eventually had to leave. "Lock-up is at 10, he told her reluctantly. "Security will come through then. They'll make you move inside the waiting room at least." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She was so tired. So bone-deep exhausted that she could barely think straight anymore. As the clock approached 10, Margaret allowed herself to face what she'd been avoiding. She pulled out the casualty list, now crumpled and water-stained from being carried in her pocket. She read James's name one more time, letting the reality of it sink in. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she'd been clinging to impossible hope. Maybe it was time to accept that some promises, no matter how sincere, couldn't be kept. She thought about their life together, all the small moments that had made up their love. Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the porch. Dancing to the radio in the living room. The way he always kissed her forehead before leaving for work. Would those memories be enough to sustain her through the years ahead? Could she build a life on the foundation of what had been, rather than what would never be? The depot clock struck 10, its chime echoing through the empty space. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting after so many hours sitting in the cold. She folded the tarp, gathering her things with mechanical precision. This was it. The end of her vigil. She had done everything she could, waited as long as humanly possible. No one could say she hadn't tried. No one could say she hadn't kept faith. She was reaching for her mother's old suitcase when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm or the depot or the night. Footsteps. Slow, irregular footsteps coming from the direction of the tracks. Margaret froze, her hand suspended above the suitcase handle. It's nothing, she told herself. Security making their rounds. Or her exhausted mind playing one final cruel trick. But the footsteps continued, growing louder. Margaret turned toward the sound, her heart beginning to hammer in her chest. Through the rain and darkness, a figure emerged. A man, walking with a pronounced limp, his clothes torn and dirty, his face obscured by the angle of his head and the shadows. He moved like someone who had traveled a very long distance on foot, each step requiring tremendous effort. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The man reached the edge of the platform's light, and slowly, painfully, he raised his head. Their eyes met. "Margaret." The voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but she knew it. God help her, even after 5 days of doubt and fear and almost giving up, she knew that voice down to her soul. "James?" Time seemed to stop. Margaret's legs moved before her brain could fully process what was happening. She ran toward him, her exhaustion forgotten, the rain and cold meaningless. She crashed into him with enough force to nearly knock them both down, and he caught her, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. "You're here," she sobbed into his chest. "You're really here. You came back." James held her like he would never let go, his face buried in her wet hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I'm late. There was a fire. The warehouse collapsed. I was trapped in the basement for 2 days before they found me. Then I woke up in a field hospital with no identification, no way to contact you. The communication systems were down. I tried everything." He pulled back enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away tears that mixed with rain. "When I was strong enough to walk, they told me I should wait for proper transport. But I couldn't. I knew you'd be worried. I knew you'd be waiting. So I left the hospital and started walking. Hitched rides when I could, walked when I couldn't. It took me 3 days to get here." Margaret stared at him, taking in the details she'd been too overwhelmed to notice at first. He was thinner, his face drawn and pale. A bandage wrapped around his head, barely visible beneath his disheveled hair. His left leg was clearly injured, causing the limp she'd heard. But he was alive. He was here. He had come back, just as he'd promised. "I never stopped believing," she said, her voice fierce. "Everyone told me to give up. They said you were dead. They showed me casualty lists with your name on it. But I knew. Somehow, I knew you were still out there, still trying to come home." James kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then finally her lips. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and salt and relief so profound it bordered on pain. "You waited," he said wonderingly. "You actually waited." "Of course I did," Margaret replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I promised." They held each other in the rain, two people who had been tested to their absolute limits and had somehow, miraculously, found their way back together. Around them, the storm continued its fury, but they barely noticed. They had weathered something far more dangerous than any weather. They had weathered doubt and distance and the cruel uncertainties of a world at war. Eventually, they made their way inside the depot building, leaving puddles on the floor as they stumbled toward the waiting room. Henry had apparently seen them from wherever he'd been waiting and had left blankets and hot coffee on one of the benches. A note in his distinctive handwriting read simply, "I knew you were right. Welcome home, James." They sat together on the bench, wrapped in blankets, sipping coffee that had never tasted so good. James told her about the fire, the collapse, the confusion afterward. Margaret told him about her vigil, about the people who had tried to convince her to leave, about the doubt that had nearly consumed her. They talked until the early hours of morning, relearning each other's voices, rebuilding the connection that 5 days of separation had strained but not broken. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Margaret realized that the rain had stopped. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. She looked at James, really looked at him, memorizing every detail of his tired, beloved face. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. James smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Now we go home. We rebuild. We remember how lucky we are." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "And we never forget what we learned here. That promises matter. That love is worth fighting for. That sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing." They left the depot as the sun rose, two figures walking slowly into the new day. Margaret carried her mother's old suitcase. James leaned on her for support, his injured leg making their progress slow. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. Behind them, the depot stood silent, a witness to a love story that would be told for years to come. The story of a woman who waited all night at the depot, and the quiet man who moved heaven and earth to make sure her faith was rewarded. The story of promises kept and hope vindicated. The story of love that refused to surrender, even when all the world said it should. And in the end, that was the only story that truly mattered.